Hey, this is Chris Thomas King, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yeah, this is so we've done a number of these. This is the second time we've recorded face to face. The last time was in the French Quarter. There's a lot of fun with my friend Rich, who he's one of those Thibodeaux and Ledays from down in the south in the bayou. And you've talked the entire time, every time we've gotten together, you've talked about the blues and the role of the blues in your history, your narrative music, but also the flawed history of the blues. So I wanted to cover that. You've written a fantastic new book. It's right behind your shoulder. Everybody can see it right there. Yeah.
Blues, the authentic narrative of my music and culture.
Yeah. And so I want to get into some of these terms because the blues, like blues itself, requires a definition, primitivism, a lot of these things. And we will spend a lot of time on this because the point is just to talk about the book and the history, but help us out with some of these terms that, like folk blues. I don't even know what that means. It's a genre, and these things change.
Yeah, I think it's really important for, everybody is not a blues or music aficionado. So, just to give them some basic terms that we're going to be using, because so like for instance, one of the important terms that the first thing we need to establish is probably what people think the story of the blues is, or what they've been told it is, because my book and what we're going to talk about is what I call the authentic narrative of the blues, meaning that this is the counter narrative. A lot of American history has been whitewashed. It's been,
propaganda, for the most part, about Native American history, African American history. It's either been obfuscated and erased from history, or it's been,
stolen in a lot of ways.
Yeah, or it's been fairy tales to kind of portray the Native American and African American as somehow primitive and somehow savage. And it was the Europeans that came and brought them Christianity and taught them how to have morals and taught them civilization, basically. That's what people have been taught in schools and things for 100 years or so. Now, where the musical part comes in is people believe that the popular narrative of the blues, or what we've been told and taught, is that the blues has something to do with slavery, that it began during slavery, probably with some work songs and some slaves, on some chain gangs or whatever, people after slavery working on chain gangs and prisoners and stuff, singing while they're working. Mm-hmm. And they call that the work song. And they're saying that was like the foundation of the blues. And then they give you this other image of the blues, that it came from Mississippi, which is the northern part of Mississippi. They call that the Mississippi Delta. And they tell you that you usually hear this story about some geezer, some old black gentleman who took a board and he tied a string to one end of the board and tied a string to the other end of the board, and he started making some sound. And then he started moaning, whatever, and singing with the board. And that was the beginning of the blues. Somehow this work song, this slave and this prisoner and this very primitive, African-American person who was waking up to the sound of it. And that's the origins of the blues and the origins of black musical culture. So that's the story that we have been told. And the rest of this podcast, we're going to tell you what the real story is, And so let's start with the definition of the Mississippi Delta.
Okay.
Because everybody have heard about the Mississippi Delta blues, heard about the Mississippi Delta and the blues that came from there. If you ever listen to rock and roll or Rolling Stones, Eric Clapton or whatever, you've heard about the Mississippi Delta blues, Muddy Waters and that type of thing. The truth of the matter is that the Mississippi Delta that we talk about in northern Mississippi, that is a mythology. It's something that's not real. It's something it's a backstory for the blues that was created to accentuate the primitiveness or the, less than human nature of black people. Because the actual Mississippi Delta is from Baton Rouge down to New Orleans Parish. That is the actual Mississippi Delta. that is where the river spills out and creates this land, this alluvial soil. And everybody knows New Orleans is rising and sinking and shifting, and we can't bury people under the ground and things because New Orleans is the Mississippi Delta.
Right.
Just like the Nile in Egypt, Egypt was built by the Nile River over 1 million years or whatever.
Right.
Same thing with New Orleans.
Okay.
And so New Orleans is the scientific Mississippi Delta.
Okay.
The delta that's in northern Mississippi, if you want to give it a scientific name, you would call it the lower Mississippi Valley. Same as Arkansas, Tennessee, northern Louisiana. These places are called the Mississippi Valley. So the actual Mississippi Delta is New Orleans, but colloquially, because Mississippi State is one with the river, we have been hypnotized to just think Mississippi Delta and we think northern Mississippi.
Right.
All right. So that's one definition. The other definition you're going to hear me talk about is Creole. And when I talk about Creole, it can be a divisive term because in black communities, Creole was kind of divisive. You had people, it came to be known as this light skinned or mixed race people who had their nose in the air or something like this. And that did happen, but that's not the origin, and that's not the way that I use the word Creole. Because the blues came from New Orleans in the 1990s, and it was created and invented by Creole black people in New Orleans, not in Mississippi.
Okay.
Creole is what the Spanish called enslaved black Africans that were born in the Spanish territories from Florida, all the way to Louisiana and in the Caribbean. Or in Haiti and places like that, the Africans that came directly from Africa were not Creole. The ones who were born in the colony, in the Spanish colony, were called designated Creole in the logs and in the record books, because they were seen as more malleable, or they would be able to speak the French language or the Spanish language and these kinds of things. So when I say Creole, I'm talking about that culture. And a lot of those people were allowed to buy their freedom through manumission, unlike in the British colonies in Virginia and South Carolina. So you had a large number of free black people in the Spanish colonies and in Louisiana in particular, versus the British colonies. And is there any other definition? I think that's a good start.
Yeah, and we can clarify things.
That's a good start. Yeah.
So in the book, you talk about a lot of histories that we're struggling right now with what people are calling critical race theory, but more importantly,
and I don't really know what critical race theory means.
It's hard when you ask someone.
I just started hearing about that in about the last couple of months.
But we do need to account for how we look at things in history. And one thing I know about history teachers in high schools and stuff, they're not like, man, these next 5 weeks we have nothing to teach. We're just kind of, So history is hard because there's a lot of it. And there's different points of view. And you think about people that live simultaneously. Like I was fascinated by Laura Ingalls Wilder during the winter. So I was reading her books, and she lived in a time with Wyatt Earp and Apaches and all these different people all kind of competing in the West. And so if you just look at one history or one biography, you can't possibly understand all of it. And because like the Ingalls Wilder family, as they all died out, the whole bunch of their stuff was in one of their old homes, which was been sold. And so the people were like, well, this is junk. And they started throwing this history out the door, right? And so only by a truckload or two going towards the dump, they were to stop it and keep all this stuff. So in early musical history, we have like the superstars like Mozart. We know about him. We know a lot about Bach. We know a lot about a couple of his kids. But yeah, I'm running out of people to talk about that. We know, Wagner. But we know a bunch of European guys who were opera writers and that kind of thing. And then it just really drops off because we just don't have these written histories. We don't have this adoration, and we haven't held these things. And so a lot of this stuff is either not known or just not studied. And it seems like a lot of the history that you bring up talks about New Orleans, which if we go back any length of time, we could talk about New Orleans in the 1500s and about the things that were happening here. And there's incredible, you guys invented Saturday night there, and, the grasshopper drink, and on and on and on. So many things happened, but we don't think of New Orleans as being this bright spot in the birthing of this nation, even though it inexorably is and has changed so many things. It was maybe one of the first metropolitan cities on this continent. I'm not talking about South America, just on the North American side. Just a lot of history.
That's right. That's true.
That we can't forget, but we don't seem to be able to keep track of it.
Yeah, the nation's first opera houses and theaters, can be traced to the late 1700s, in New Orleans.
Right.
Yeah. So New Orleans, it's when it comes culturally, it's kind of the root of American culture. I call it the heartbeat of the nation.
Yeah.
Not only do the river and those runs and all the way from the Tennessee mountains and all those kind of things run and spill out and create New Orleans,
right?
But it's like it's just like those are like the veins,
yeah.
And New Orleans is like the heartbeat, and that's where because America didn't really have a culture separate from Europe.
Right.
When you speak of classical music, Bach, Amadeus, things like this, Beethoven, you think in Europe.
Right.
And, you're trying to emulate Europe.
Right.
But that's what was unique about Creole culture, is that Creole culture was kind of subversive. It didn't want to acquiesce or just kind of become European.
Right.
It said, no, we have our own ideas. We have our own way of expression. And that's kind of like what the blues became and why the blues is really America's gift to the world, because it gave America a unique identity that is unlike, Europe, and it's crucial to say that when you say something was born in a Spanish colony as opposed to Africa, that's what the definition of Creole originally was. Mm-hmm. That's the same as the blues. Most people think the blues came from Africa. They think that people got on these ships with a banjo or something and sung the blues on their way to the Atlantic slave trade. That didn't happen. The blues was born actually in New Orleans in the 1890s. So it is a Creole invention and not an African invention. Now the instruments are African. They date back to Africa many, many hundreds of thousands of years ago. Right. But the actual philosophy, the musical philosophy is something that was invented and came about and was birthed in New Orleans. And that kind of gave America a unique identity.
So many times in history, geography is a big driving factor. The wheel is not invented for industrial purposes in South America because they just didn't have draft animals. It didn't make sense. And I think about if you're some guy working on some kind of a trade ship, a barge, whatever it is, coming down the Mississippi, when you get to New Orleans and you offload your product, you get paid. And then you're going to go find some trouble in town. Mm-hmm. And so you guys become this destination in New Orleans where can we go to have a great time, spend a bunch of money? And that is just geographically, it's a different source for fun because, to be unfair to the European music thing, it's very staid. It's religious. Bach was a Kapellmeister, working in churches and writes incredible music, but you guys are writing music to get
playing that huge organ, man.
Oh my God! Yeah,
the whole church was just an organ.
Yeah,
wasn't it?
Having dudes pump about bellows, like they got. Yeah, it's a different thing though when you come down and people are looking for a good time with their pockets full of cash, and if you run an establishment, whether you're trading in ladies or spirits or gambling, you want that music. You want people to get. You don't want people to sit still and be like, "Oh yes, thank you, that's wonderful." You want people. You want Saturday night. I mean, it just now striking me how the geography impacts this too. So when you're talking about that, you want people to get up out of those parlor chairs and move and grab a lady by the waist. It's early on, one of the songs is funky butt, and this is a term that you would think would be something different today.
Yeah, that's, I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm just interjecting that funky butt is one of the known songs of Buddy Bolden. He's supposed to be the original, blues trumpet player. Right. That kind of started it all, and starting around 1895. But go ahead.
Yeah, but you don't write a song like Funky Butt because you want people to sit still. It's a little dangerous. It's a little sexy. It's guys who are blowing steam off from having to work and haul this grain down this river for 2,000 miles. So they're either coming to a party or going home.
Yeah.
And it's all hard in between. And so they get to New Orleans and want to have a great time, and the music reflects that. So it makes a lot of sense. Someone like Buddy Bolden, is he the spark? Who's the guy? Like, we can trace some rock and roll roots to Ike Turner, right? Like there's a legitimate claim that like he's one of the first rock and roll songs because of the way they use the amplifier and everything. But is there that moment in the blues? Is it Buddy Bolden? Is it someone before that?
That's a very good question. So it got me I have to ponder that a little bit. But to what you were saying just earlier about people wanting to just let their hair down and cut loose. And, you have to put that, if you put that in context in the late 1890s, and I'm going to get back to the Buddy Bolden thing, but Victorian culture and the prudishness of Victorian culture, you couldn't even sit at the table and say, could you pass the, if you're having chicken, you couldn't say pass the breast, or, you know what I mean? Or the thigh, this was like
PC.
Yeah. So, Victorian culture was what everybody in America was aspiring to. Like I said, America didn't have its own identity.
Right.
And it was trying to compete or trying to adapt, European, mores. And so Victorian culture, prudishness, there was also a movement of prohibition. Women were trying to stop, the sale of alcohol. And this was going on in the 1890s. New Orleans had a place called Storyville. And in Storyville, everything went, gambling, prostitution, and there was a lot of music like Jelly Roll Martin and so many piano players was playing those love parlors. So New Orleans was a very open city when it comes to free expression and just kind of you can be yourself. One of the earliest blues musicians was openly gay. Who Jelly Roll Martin learned from. So New Orleans was a unique place. It always had been a unique place in America, and people were really at this time, people were really identified, and this is important to the birth of the blues. People were really identified by religion. We had come out of, America had been founded to be free from, the tyranny of the church, from the Roman church that just ran Europe, for 1,000 years.
Yeah. The
The whole Protestant thing was about breaking with that.
Yeah.
So Anglo-Saxon Protestantism was a big deal in America, and to be a first class American, you really needed to be Anglo-Saxon Protestant and male. That would help as well.
Right.
Now, New Orleans had come through, Spanish laws and the Roman, Castilian laws or whatever. And so, Catholicism was big in Louisiana, and it clashed with Protestantism. And voodoo was big in Louisiana. And so voodoo, because the Haitian people that fought the revolution in Haiti, and a lot of them came into Louisiana and brought their rhythms, the red beans, and a lot of their culture into Louisiana. And they brought the love of opera and opera houses and stuff into Louisiana. And they had money. They came here as free people to North America as free people after fighting that revolution. And they mingled with the free people of Louisiana. And that grew a large class of people that were well off. But as far as the battle between the Protestantism and voodoo and Catholicism, because voodoo and black people had mixed voodooism with Catholicism.
Yeah.
And that's where you get a lot of, the way that they would, express their spirituality would be very different from Protestant worship. But the Protestants came in, Anglo-Saxon Protestants came into Louisiana and started blue laws. And they started putting up posters and laws and making these codes where you can't dance on a Sunday. You can't gamble on Sunday.
Yeah.
You can't go to the ball. You can't go out to Congo Square and play your drums and guitars. You can't do this. You can't do that. You can't. And it's like, that's just totally antithetical to Louisiana culture.
Right.
I mean, the enslaved people and the free black people have been playing their guitars and drums in Congo Square since, 200 years before the Anglo-Saxons came in, before Louisiana became Americanized. So freedom of expression is kind of what the blues, developed to push back against, to say that the church is not going to control, we're going to have freedom of expression. And Protestantism isn't going to control us. And we're not going to be embarrassed because we're not Victorian enough for you. And so young ladies will go out to these clubs, the Funky Butt Hall and some of these other places on Pareto Street down in New Orleans, to these joints. And they would take out what women had to wear, these garter things that they had to tie up. Yeah. And they had these, corsets, they had corset closets and stuff they get rid of that. They might leave home in that stuff, but then they get rid of it, at the parties. And the musicians have been playing things like Scottish and formal dances for, that's what slaves played. They played Scottish and, if you did the waltz and then you played the waltz, the music wasn't dictating. People didn't just stand around and watch you play the music.
Right.
You were just there to accompany the dancing.
Right.
And then they'll have a little cake and have some tea and drink a little this, a little punch, and then they'll dance some more, and everybody dance with a partner. And they had formal dances, Scottish and this type of thing. And so, the blues broke with all of that. And so the blues, you got people playing, and this slow blues thing that people do. I have a new song called Slow Dragon Blues. Mm-hmm. Well, Buddy Bolden would slow it down, and everybody would, after midnight, and everybody would kind of, after they do all the quadrilles and all of that, then the late night thing after midnight, they would play a lot of slow blues, these long slow blues numbers. Mm-hmm. And people would be grinding. It was pretty, lascivious, it was really sensual in these places. And so parents didn't want their kids going out and dealing with this kind of music because it was
cool.
Yeah. Every generation have their music that run their parents nuts and scare society, Well, that's what the blues was in the 1890s coming out of New Orleans. And yes, back to your question. Yeah. Buddy Bolden was the earliest known performer that we know of that was really influential. Mm-hmm. He was the biggest. I can't say he was the first. Who knows who was the first? Right. Because Mamie Desdunes, a piano player, was the first person that Jelly Roll Martin said he heard playing the blues. He lived near her home. He lived with his godmother up in the Garden District, and he would hear Mamie Desdunes playing the piano, playing a famous song called 219 Blues that Janis Joplin and so many other singers have recovered by different names. Sometimes they do call it 219 Blues. Yeah. But he would hear her. He said that was the first introduction that he had to the blues as a boy in the 1890s. But but Buddy Bolden, as early as 1895, we have public record and newspaper accounts and eyewitness accounts that he was playing the blues in 1895 in New Orleans. And I'll just add that in 1895, this area in the Mississippi Delta, in the mythologized Mississippi Delta, there was no musical culture there in 1895. There were almost no black people living there. Right. And as a matter of fact, there were never any black slaves in the mythologized state of Mississippi Delta. Huh. That there was never any black slavery or black history there. It just never happened. Those are fairy tales and mythology. So New Orleans is the first place that blues was played anywhere in the world. And you don't have to worry about, well, what were they playing in Mississippi? Yeah. They weren't playing anything because there weren't any black people in this area called the Mississippi Delta. Yeah. It didn't happen.
You always say that there's panthers and bears out there.
Yeah, there were wild bears. Yeah. Florida panthers and wild wolves. That's where Teddy Roosevelt would go hunting bear. That's where the teddy bear story comes from. Right. Which I also talk about in my book.
In the book, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so there's not even slaves, there's not plantations, and even if there were, there's not enough, that's working places.
It was just a frontier wilderness. Right. But just so people are not confused, I just have to trigger their memory because people have been hypnotized when they hear Mississippi Delta. They don't even think about New Orleans, which is the Mississippi Delta.
Right. It literally is.
But in northern Mississippi, this area in Coahoma County, in places where they say that the blues was born or the blues come from, there were never any slaves there because people think that the word blues in the English language, that's another definition I wanted to give early on. The word blues in English, in the Anglo language, means, the dictionary says, down in the dumps, sad, melancholy, depressed, and all these kinds of things. And so people associate that, well, with the slaves, they had to be down in the dumps and depressed and all of that. And they were, of course. Yeah. But they sung what they call spirituals, what W.B. Du Bois called songs of sorrow. I can assure you, and I can promise you, that Buddy Bolden on Saturday night in New Orleans was not playing sorrow songs and songs of woe and want. Right. And these juke joints in the funky butt. That's not what was happening in the funky butt. And when he played a slow blues, it had nothing to do with I'm sad and down in the dumps. It was all about grinding, slow dragging. Right. It was slow dragging music, which was a dance that most people thought was outrageous, you know? Yeah. Most people thought it wasn't even a dance at all, right. You know? But in the French language, which most people in Louisiana spoke French, black people spoke French up until the 1930s. Jelly Roll Martin's parents even spoke French. And Mamie Desdune's parents spoke French, and she probably spoke French as well, or what we call Creole, you know, kind of French African mixture, and a little English and African and French kind of mixed in together. And so in that language, the word blues means holy shit, you know, like the blues means like, okay, this is mocking God, or this is what the Protestants would say that it's the devil's music. Okay. You know, because, blue entertainment is like Richard Pryor being a blue comic. Right. Or Dave Chappelle, you know, he's a blue comic. He'll say some stuff in his stand up and you say, holy shit, did he just say that? Chris Rock, you know, did he just say that? Yeah. That's blue entertainment, you know, and that's, when you go on Bourbon Street and you see people, the burlesque dancers or people stripping and doing their thing. And back in the day, Jelly Roll used to play the music, you know, while all kind of acts of love was going on. Yeah. So, this is blue entertainment in French language. So it don't have nothing to do with being down sad and down in the dumps unless you, don't have somebody to go home with, you know what I mean? So that's very important to understand that the Creole term for blues, when Jelly Roll called his songs the Jelly Roll Blues, West End Blues, Basin Street Blues, all these, you know, songs came out of Louisiana called the such and such a blues. They were talking more in a French Creole definition as opposed to when the music left Louisiana and went to Chicago and Harlem and, you know, became anglicized and the definition changed. And that's why we have this. That's one of the reasons we have a lot of confusion.
So Jelly Roll and his buddies that played the piano and Bolden who plays the trumpet, these guys are Creole or are heavily influenced by Creole folk if they're not themselves. They have the French roots, and so they are thinking about it in terms of the blue, B-L-E-U, as opposed to...
B-L-E-U as in sacre blue, right, sacre deal. You know, sacre blue is the creolized version of that when it comes to music and entertainment. It's just blue entertainment. And
you, I mean, obviously, you're a musician of like a fantastic note, but we've also talked to other musicians, and there's so many of them that look at their job as being, my job is to get you laid. Like Harry Connick Jr. doesn't go there to have everybody crying. Bobby Brown doesn't sing and dance the way he sings and dance to make everybody not want to have sex. You know, Keith Sweat's last name Sweat isn't because, you know, like he's hot. Like, no, there's a sexuality to it. These slow drags, it's probably been a thing for all of history. The
name Jelly Roll itself.
Okay, what is that?
I'll let people look it up. Okay. But I mean, it's, you know.
Jelly Roll is interesting because he is recorded. You talk about this in the book, and I'm talking about source material now because your book is annotated as if it's an actual legitimate history because it is, right? And so you've got these Library of Congress recordings, and there's more than just spoken word history. So we have the fact that there are songs called Whining Boy Blues, who's also Jelly Roll. Jelly Roll Blues is all these blues songs that predate what we are told is the first blues songs in the early 1900s. But also,
they try to make the blues come out of Mississippi. Right. And the first blues recordings didn't come out of Mississippi until around 1928.
Right.
And so that means that's 30 years after the music had already been in New Orleans and reached its plateau and left New Orleans.
Yeah.
It was 30 years after the fact that the music showed up in the Mississippi Delta.
Is ragtime an early form of the blues or an alternate genre? I mean, that's
ragtime and blues are totally two different things.
Okay.
Now, because ragtime is not an improvised music.
Okay.
You know, blues is improvised.
Right.
You know, blues is rebelling against tyranny, whether it be the conductor saying you got to play the written score exactly as it was written. Well, the blues is not going to do that. You know, we might play your Broadway tune. We might play, you know, a popular, even a Christian hymn, a Christian tune, like When the Saints Go Marching In, but we're going to blue it. We're going to take it and we might play the national anthem, you know, but, you know, we're going to take the national anthem and we're going to create our own statement with it.
Right.
You know, so the blues can take any song, you know, and blue it.
Right.
You know, you can, that's the whole point of the blues. It's like taking something that the Anglo-Saxon Protestants held sacred.
Yeah.
And then mucking it up. You know what I mean? Making either, not necessarily mucking it up. You want to mock it a little bit, but at the same time, you know, that freedom of expression allows you to say, hey, I'm going to take this and make it my own thing. I'm going to add my own take on it or give my own interpretation of it. You know what I mean? It's not so sacred to me that I can't express it in my Creoleized way as opposed to just totally trying to, because the other thing which a lot of people outside of Louisiana tried to do is they tried to match European artists' art and culture. They thought they were taught or they believed that European classical music and European art and European expression or whatever that was the way to measure your own talents or your own intellectual ability or your own capabilities. And so they would try to emulate and sing an opera perfectly as a European would do it, you know, paint exactly like a painter would do it. Whereas Basquiat, you know, did a whole different thing and made it into the galleries. And people pay millions of dollars for his paintings now, as opposed to trying to emulate, some European painter. So that's what the blues was doing, and that's what the Creole culture was doing. It was saying that we don't want to lose. And what was happening is that Plessy versus Ferguson and Separate but Equal, where people had made these laws where we were going to have Jim Crow, meaning that Black Africans in Louisiana, Black people, Black Creoles had been free all this time for a couple hundred years, and they had been able to go where they wanted to go. They had their own businesses and things like this. And, you know, the Americanization of Louisiana is like, we got to put a stop to this because you're going to have to act like the rest of the states, you know, and you're going to have to abide by these British, you know, Anglo-Saxon type of, you know, prudish, you know, Victorian Protestant type of laws. And, you know, no more mixed racing, you know, dating, or some families were mixed race. Right. And those families were split apart. But they fought Jim Crow, and with a case called Plessy versus Ferguson all the way to the Supreme Court. It lost, but it was during that fight that the defiant sound of the blues sprang up, you know, throughout New Orleans, and people called themselves the Creole Band, and you got all kinds of Black bands call themselves the Creole Band, Right. King Oliver's Creole Band, which Louis Armstrong played with. And they created blues, the Creole Band, and here's our song, the China Blues, or West End Blues, or whatever it may be.
Some of these early blues players, Tony Jackson, is that the guy that taught Jelly Roll?
Tony Jackson, yeah.
Got it right, yes. Because there's so many of these names. And he's widely regarded as being a wonderful piano player and improviser. You know, whenever Jelly Roll, you talked about this, whenever Jelly Roll walks in the room, he plays a certain song to communicate, hey, I see you, I love you, you know, openly gay, which seems impossible back then. And Black, like, why is that guy even alive? Like, we would think he would get destroyed, but he helps.
I don't know if you noticed, I don't want to break your thought, but I don't know if you noticed, there weren't a lot of lynchings in New Orleans for interracial dating. People should think about that.
That happens somewhere else then, right?
I'm just saying, New Orleans is a different culture.
Right.
Go ahead about Tony Jackson.
You have these guys that are incredibly talented. It's one thing to like say, some loose limbed Negro is playing a song, but these guys are actual musicians, working professionals, top of the game, doing it. And then, and you make the great point in your book, like Mozart is respected because he comes up as this child prodigy. And it turns out there are a lot of people that have that skill. And one of the things that Mozart and Beethoven are known for is sitting down and having like improvisation, contests with the local badass piano player. And so when people are critical of Jelly Roll or whoever it is, like, oh, they were too young. Were they? I mean, how old do you have to be a prodigy and have talent and chops that's better than any adult in the area if you're touring around? Yeah,
you're talking about a section in my book where I talk about Jelly Roll Martin. Mm-hmm. And Jelly Roll Martin said that he had gotten into a debate an argument, a very public argument with W.C. Handy. Because W.C. Handy was going around telling people he was the father of the blues. Mm. And, his song, St. Louis Blues, which was very popular, he was saying that was the first blues song, and he heard somebody in Mississippi playing the blues and all this. But it turns out, all these years later, maybe about 15 years ago, we have proof and record of the fact that the early people that W.C. Handy heard in Mississippi, that he claimed he got the idea to create the blues from, we know the person's name and we know what song the person was singing.
Oh, wow.
Because somebody got a copy of one of W.C. Handy's early biographies, a manuscript of it before it was edited and things. And it was Prince McCoy was the guy's name that he heard playing in Mississippi.
Right.
They gave him an idea to write his first blues song, the Memphis Blues. And the song the guy was playing, W.C. Handy wrote that the guy was playing Whining Boy Blues, which is Jelly Roll Martin's famous song.
Right.
He used to be called Whining Boy.
Right.
And we're recording a podcast, but it's my daughter. I guess you can work with that.
Yeah, just kind of back up and then give me that Whining Boy part. And we'll go from there.
Yeah. So what W.C. Handy, the Memphis Blues was created after he heard this Louisiana musician who happened to be in Mississippi singing Jelly Roll Martin's song, Whining Boy, which is what Jelly Roll Martin's name.
Yeah.
That's his signature song. So when Jelly Roll Martin wrote to Downbeat magazine, which was like the Rolling Stone of its day, Rolling Stone isn't Rolling Stone now, but people who remember rock and roll, they know that Rolling Stone was kind of like the Bible of rock and roll.
Right.
Well, before that, Downbeat magazine was the magazine for the hippest music and the popular music in America. And Jelly Roll Martin wrote to the magazine denouncing W.C. Handy as a fraud. Mm. And he was saying that this guy stole my music, and I invented the blues, not W.C. Handy.
Yeah.
And people for years said that Jelly Roll Martin was some kind of kook or too arrogant or he was a joke and this and that. But the man was telling the truth.
Yeah.
Now, he had said that he first wrote the song Jelly Roll Blues in 1902.
Right.
Now, we don't know if that's true or not because we have no way to verify that.
Right.
But he did publish Jelly Roll Blues as a published sheet music in 1915. And that's one of the it's not the earliest published song, but it's one of the earliest ones.
Right.
But, so Jelly Roll Martin is, even though Buddy Bolden predates him, Jelly Roll Martin is musically, is the person who brought the whole musical philosophy together. The whole blues music and New Orleans musical philosophy together. He's the one that was able to put all the elements together. Take what the brass bands was doing and arrange that to the piano.
Yeah.
Take the Spanish rhythms, the triplet, that kind of little feel in the blues that you hear all in Fats Domino music, and that you hear in Little Richard. That little triplet feel is so important to the blues, and that's kind of that Spanish Tresillo, kind of influence. So Jelly Roll Martin is a huge figure and totally underrated. And they need to make a real motion picture about Jelly Roll Martin. He is like I won't call him necessarily the father of the blues, but he was like, no doubt the first blues genius that we could hear his music. We don't have any recordings of Buddy Bolden.
When you talk about what it takes to publish a song back,
and we don't have any recordings of Tony Jackson.
Wow, that's a
he
shame.
never recorded.
Yeah. Because it's so early in the recording process.
The blues totally predates the phonograph record. Now they had the phonograph recordings happening, but black people wasn't allowed to record, especially the ones they had some people doing jokes and spiritual things and kind of what you would call novelty records and stuff.
Right.
But black people weren't allowed to perform the blues there, and because that was too obscene and too dangerous, to the establishment.
Well, and really, Tony's job is to go play in a barrel house, and he's like, I'm working. I'm busy doing this and being a star. I mean, in his own right, in his own time, that's what he did. So back to Jelly Roll, though, when he's putting all this together, and I don't know, you have to tell me, he's either talented enough to score music by hand, or he knows enough, he can extract it from his head to tell a person who can score it. Could he score his own music?
Yeah, you were talking about how young he would have been. See, in 1902, when he wrote Jelly Roll Blues, if he did indeed write it in 1902, he would have been either 12 years old or 17 years old.
Right.
Because we don't know when he was born. He was born either in 1885 or 1890.
Right.
We don't know for sure. I don't know. I don't know, if he know for sure, because it was all kind of different dates through his lifetime. But he would have been very young. But musical genius shows up early,
Right.
But people needed to discredit Jelly Roll Morton, not just to discredit him, but they didn't want Louisiana to be part of the blues narrative and the folk music narrative. They didn't really want that. They wanted the blues narrative to be primitive. They wanted to justify Jim Crow. They wanted to justify discrimination. They wanted to justify, interracial marriaging being outlawed. They wanted to justify the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s marching up and down Washington, D.C. And, they wanted to justify white supremacy. And so you can't have white supremacy and put Jelly Roll Morton up there with Mozart at the same time.
Yeah.
It just, we got to somehow discredit this man. We got to somehow discredit this, because New Orleans culture was so unique to America that it's even today, it still haven't really been told. We've learned about Tulsa, the massacre in Tulsa where they flew planes and dropped bombs on the people's stores and their businesses and stuff. Yeah. And everybody just figure, well, everybody in Oklahoma, the Okies, they're just poor people.
Yeah.
And, they don't realize that these black people had this thriving community, you know, and imagine what the community would have been if it had been able to continue.
Right.
But we're just learning about that. But New Orleans culture, you can times that about 50, and the Creole New Orleans culture that went on all through slavery and all through the 1800s, the 1800s, that went on all through the 1800s, surpasses Tulsa times 50.
Right.
And the music, the high art music and the blues and the things that came out of there is just a hint at what was going on in Louisiana. It's the same way. So they try to erase New Orleans almost from the South. It's almost the same way they did with Egypt. You have black, science and astronomy and music and instruments and stuff and all this culture and the pyramids and all that. They try to take Africa and they try to take Egypt and erase it from Africa because it don't fit. That black people should just be hanging from trees in the jungle.
Right.
And they were lucky that they were enslaved and brought to America so that they could, one day become, civilized or equal. They're not yet equal, but maybe in another 500 years, they'll be equal with the white man, So it's this kind of thinking that was going on in the early 1900s when the blues came on the scene. And that's why the blues was seen as being subversive and dangerous, because white kids loved the blues.
Right.
They loved this music in the 1920s. They went to Harlem, and white women went down to Harlem as flapper girls and stuff and was getting their groove on.
Yeah.
And this was shocking.
Yeah.
And so this music had to be pushed underground. Its heroes had to be discredited, or had to be driven underground. They couldn't, get sponsorships on radio shows and things. I mean, it just had to be destroyed in some way, and it had to be demonized. And this whole idea that the blues is the devil's music, people in, the Louisiana early musicians took that as a badge of honor. But that don't work that well in the marketplace, when you're trying to sell music to, white families in Nebraska. It just isn't, that's not what you want to be selling to a nice, polite family,
Right. And even like today, or at least in the recent modern times, having your music associated as devil music made you more money. Kids
exactly.
Knights and Satan's or just a rock and roll band, whatever.
That's right.
When we look at, so Buddy Bolden, Jelly Roll Morton, these guys have real, true talent. But it wasn't, the music industry was different. Music industry also has its history of ripping off artists since probably there ever was a music industry.
That's right.
Was there an incentive to publish your own things, or were you just happy to hear some other, your song coming out of some other barrel house or whatever? I mean, why would it be normal for Jelly Roll to publish early works? Or just,
you were asking earlier, and I get on these long answers.
No, but it's a fact.
But you asked me about was he writing music and stuff?
Yeah.
All of these early musicians wrote music.
Right.
Okay. But in the blues psyche, for the folk blues sociologists and folklorists, that disqualifies you.
Right.
You have to be primitive and illiterate. You have to be like Leadbelly in Angola prison or working on a chain gang.
Yeah.
Now you're authentic. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But if you can read some sheet music and this and that, then you're acting European, or, you're not being real. You're not being your true self, which is, this primitive, noble savage or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, they could write music. And you was asking about, printing music. A lot of black musicians, it was rare that they would get their music printed. So when he printed, Jelly Roll Blues, that was, pretty, advanced.
Right.
For him to chart out his music and actually get it printed, and sell it. But that shows you what he thought of his own compositions.
Right.
W.C. Handy had started doing it, a couple of years before Jelly Roll. But the first blues compositions that were published by, an Italian in New Orleans. And he published a tune called I Got the Blues in 1908. And that's the earliest known music, sheet music that was published, in what we could call the early New Orleans blues. And then in later years, the Italian, he was a Sicilian. He said that he had got that sound. He had heard this song being sung by a black man in Algiers, which is across the river from New Orleans.
Right.
And he said he asked the man what the name of the song was, and the man said that it's called I Got the Blues. But he published it. Right. And he was a musician himself and published the tune and had some success with it. And then there was some other black performers from New Orleans who published their music before Jelly Roll. And then W.C. Handy started publishing his music a little bit after these songs were first published.
Right.
And, so W.C. Handy wasn't the first to publish.
I don't want to primitivize the musicians of that time, but again, the industry is nascent. It's not fully developed. And so when someone like Handy comes along, he realizes there's all this gold just laying around. He can just scoop it up because.
And then let's be honest. A lot of people were illiterate.
Right.
And a lot of people, black and white, were illiterate back then. And then you had a lot of immigrants coming from, Eastern Europe into America. I'm not here to say that they were all illiterate, right, but a lot of them hadn't adapted to American language or speaking English. They came, they came from Poland, or they came from, the southern part of Europe,
right,
things like this, to Italians and things. And so, English just wasn't, everybody just wasn't, writing and reading newspapers written in English.
Right.
And, so.
Was there an incentive though, like in the 1890s to write music? Was there a financial motive to write?
Yeah, because there were no records. That's for all through ever since Amadeus and them was doing it.
Right.
Music was mostly, sold on sheet music. That's how you made money. You didn't make money necessarily performing music. You made money from, selling sheet music. Families, when you didn't have record players and phonograph players and things, families had to entertain themselves. So you'd have middle class families or highbrow families with, their daughters would be trained to play the piano or, the guitar or something, a parlor instrument or something. And so on holidays or special occasions, somebody in the family, your cousin or somebody had to pull out an instrument and play it. Mm-hmm. People made music for themselves. Right. Or they might go to the theater, and see some music performed. Right. But at home, the only music that you heard was music that somebody in the family played. Yeah. And so, as the industry kind of got going with the phonograph, well, a lot of that changed. People started bringing home pre-canned, pre-recorded music. Yeah. And a lot of people didn't think that was legitimate. Yeah. And the old folk blues people, felt that this was somehow spoiling the primitive nature of the black musician, because they're, they move into cities and they're losing their culture. And this is important to just say that John Lomax, Deborah Scarborough, and some of the early folk people who went out and recorded what they call folk music. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a legitimate folk music for the Appalachian people who were pre-literate, Elizabethan era, 16th century songs. They were still singing these kinds of songs like Barbary Allen and other songs, and singing about Robin Hood and all these things, Scarborough Fair and these kinds of songs. And these songs were documented and everything by a folk society in Cambridge at Harvard. And that they kind of created the first folk society around the turn of the century, between the 1890s and early 1900s. Mm-hmm. And the criteria for folk music was you had to be literate. Mm-hmm. The music had to be passed down from a family member, you couldn't have gotten a musical master or somebody to teach you music. Right. It had to be just passed on. And it wasn't performed with drums and all kinds of other instruments. Mm-hmm. And that was legitimately how the lowlands of England and Scotland and places, that's how they performed the music. Milkmaids and plowmen. Yeah. That's how they sang these songs, these long ballads, Yeah. But then these folk people, John Lomax and them, decided they would take that same English and Anglo-Saxon criteria and apply that same criteria to African folk music to create, what is African? They started collecting folk music from the African American. These are white Anglo-Saxon people using that criteria to record and define what is folk music, what is authentic black music. And that's really where my book kind of really takes off. Right. Because that false equivalency, it's a false equivalency. And so they say, well, where's the poorest, most depraved place that black Americans are that we can equate to the Appalachians? Right. Well, that isn't New Orleans. Right. So so the Mississippi Delta has a, we can equate these two. So, but the problem with that false equivalency, thing is that, what this downtrodden, state that the black people in North America was in is what slavery had wrought. It wasn't natural. Mm-hmm. It wasn't something that they had fought to be illiterate, or they might have came to America literate in their own languages from West Africa. I mean, black Africans, created paper. The papyrus comes from, you must have something that you want to write down if you're going to invent paper. Right. You really moved to write something, you know what I mean? Yeah. So, ink and writing and all the, when you open those tombs in ancient Egypt, you see writing. This is like 5,000, 6,000 years ago. Right. And then in West Africa, we know in Timbuktu, people were, highly literate, even based back into, and I talk about it in my book a little toward the end, in the 1300s, there were so many manuscripts, and there's still so many manuscripts that has still haven't really been made available to the public.
Right.
So they came from literate societies. But when they came and were enslaved, reading was outlawed.
Right.
They wanted to break these people down and make them more malleable.
Right.
So this idea that this black person he got this twine and a piece of board and he's just waking up to civilization from the jungle.
Right.
And now he's learning music harmony. It's nuts because, black people invented harmony. People might tell you about Pythagoras. An apple fell on his head or whatever the thing is, and he heard some sounds or something. But that's thousands of years after Africans had already created the trumpet.
Right.
After they had already created the clarinet.
Sure.
After they had already created the harp, which is basically a piano. So when you leave out of context all of that history of black Africans, and you just kind of erase all of that from school books and this critical race stuff where you don't even want to talk about. I got a problem with the 1619 project.
Sure.
I think it has a lot of gaps in it that needs to be, it needs to be worked on.
Yeah.
But, to say that you can't even teach it or somehow that's going to destroy, this is like nuts. So, the idea that, so that's the definition of folk music, and it's a false equivalency. And when they came into the blues, Lomax and them, they didn't want, even though the music was in the 20s and 30s, you go to Harlem, you go to any place in Harlem and you can hear some great blues, you can hear some great musicians. So why is he traveling down through the South going to chain gangs and prisons? Looking for the real, that's not the real black music. I'm going to look for the real black music because he needed some music that represented black people that that represented their primitive nature. What he believed black people were these primitive, jungle people, and they needed some music to represent that.
There are so many things to continue to talk about. I want to move forward in the book though, because I think people are getting what you're saying. And just to clarify, in case it's not coming across to what we've already said, what people say are the beginnings of the blues.
It's a fairy tale.
Yeah, there's songs before that literally called the blues.
That's right.
That they're saying, that didn't exist, I guess.
They call it, they try to redefine it. They try to say it's Dixieland jazz, or that is jazz, or that is swing, or something.
You made me laugh when you talked about this in the book, and you're like, come on, you think black people are going to play something called Dixieland?
That's
come
right.
on. It's laughable. That's why you laugh at it. There are a couple of times when you're just like, you set this thing up and you talk about how preposterous it is that this could even be true. It's not true. And blues songs pre-exist this. And there's that jazz versus jazz era when.
Yeah, jazz is a misnomer.
Right. Okay.
For blues.
Right.
It's like this water I'm drinking right here. Right. I'm trying to get into a theater, right? Yeah. And I want to bring my vodka into the theater.
Yeah.
And they say, well, what is that you have? And it's just some water.
Yeah.
And you slip it into the theater.
Yeah.
So, jazz is a misnomer for blues. When blues became a pejorative, and, America wanted to clamp down on it, then, you had to kind of give it some other name, swing, jazz, or whatever. But if you take this vodka and you go years later, generations come along and they don't realize that it was a ruse, that it was called jazz, because jazz is a meaningless word.
Right.
It don't have any etymology. I researched that word as much as I could research, and it took me 10 years to write my book.
Yeah.
There's no, that word don't go back to any. Africans speak thousands of languages. It don't go back to any African language. It don't go back to any language in Brazil or in the Caribbean, or it's not Creole. Nobody in New Orleans spoke the word jazz before they left New Orleans. Nobody had even heard of the word.
And if you talk to anybody who does etymology for a living, a professor or whatever, they would be desperate to find a word that had been unattributed and find it and nail it down. So
and the musicians call their music the blues.
They call it they call it the blues. Yeah. And Jelly Roll Morton's like, I was a kid, but I was playing the blues, and he wouldn't be the first musician to go out and make a living. Again, Mozart's a great example. He went on the road and he got paid all the time. Yeah, and if generations come along, if you don't really go back in history and set the record straight, and trigger people's memory.
because I do think a lot of people know these things, but it's just out of sight, out of mind. Their conscience need to be reawakened to it. But if you don't do that, then generations come along thinking that this vodka, they're going to try to water their plants with it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they're wondering why the plants ain't growing, but hey, man, that never was water. You know what I mean? It was just, that's how we had to sell this stuff or get it across.
Right.
But, while we're talking about jazz, and I'm not here to tell jazz musicians, white or black, you don't have to be black to play the blues.
Right.
You don't have to be black to call yourself Creole. These are cultures.
Okay. And
you can join the culture and become a part of that culture, just like to be a Chickasaw part of this Chickasaw nation.
Right.
If they accept you and you go through the rituals and everything, then you're a part of that nation.
Right.
It's not necessarily a blood thing. I mean, what is the DNA of an American?
Yeah.
You're American because you swore the oath or whatever. You went through the ritual to become an American. And so, Creole culture is not, even though it was defined in the Spanish logs as black, the Cajun people now call themselves Creole.
Sure.
You had French people even wanting to call themselves Creole or whatever. They don't do it as much now, but a lot of white Louisianians, would try to claim Creoleness because they just won't let black people have anything nice, If black people have something nice, the people they just can't stand it. They got to come and claim it, So this is not a thing about jazz that I have against jazz anything. Mm-hmm. But these jazz musicians have to stop calling themselves jazz musicians. They are blues musicians. Mm-hmm. And if they're playing this music that Miles Davis played, that John Coltrane played, that Duke Ellington played, that Louis Armstrong played, that Jelly Roll Morton played, that Chris Thomas King plays, then you're in the blues tradition. Mm. Now, blues, rock and roll is blues. Right. It's just blues with a different marketing term, So,
Has jazz not broken off, though, and become its own subgenre of the blues? I mean, is there, because
that's fair. You can call it a derivative or a subgenre, but when it gets too far away from the blues, what is it? Right. I don't, you know what I mean? It's like, it's not, it's neither fish nor flesh, it's like, it's not here nor there, people can't dance to it. Right. And it's just some musician just jacking off, you might call that jizzing or whatever. I don't know. Jizz. But I mean, it's not, it can get to a point to where it's just not, connected to any cultural movement or, if the blues is a cultural, an expression of the Creole culture. Right. So it's not a commercial, it wasn't a commercial term because there was no commerciality there were no records when Buddy Bolden was playing. Right. He wasn't trying to get on the charts, the Billboard chart. There was no Billboard chart. Yeah. And playing the kind of music he was playing, he was never going to be accepted even in high society type of venues. Right. A lot of the high class people were never going to book him. Right. So he was thumbing his nose at these Victorian type of people from the get-go. He's like, I don't even want to be invited to your party. You know what I mean? We're going to have our own party and we're not, we're just as what we got going on here is just as good. Yeah.
There's definitely a corollary that matches. Like if you're in LA and you are getting paid to go out every night and play music and party, you're playing the Hollywood Bowl every night. That's your home gig. Mm-hmm. You're also not likely to want to go on the road. You're like, I go into my house 5 miles away, I chill out, and then I go to the Hollywood Bowl and I work every night and everybody dances their ass off and have a great time. You wouldn't want to leave New Orleans if you had this great gig. Maybe you go to Chicago, maybe you go to Harlem, but also it would be totally normal to say, I'm going to raise my family here. I'm going to go play this music. I don't have to. You're in the major leagues right there. So I can see why people want to devalue what's happening there. But there are musicians that play in Vegas their whole life. They give up like their artistic expression because they go and they play at Ka or any of the Cirque shows. Mm-hmm. But they'll play 6,000 shows. One of our friends plays bass and he plays at Ka and he's played over 6,000 shows.
That's a lot of shows.
Right. And he gets paid. He's got benefits, steady job, and it's a wonderful thing to be able to express yourself.
Yeah, my bass player, he was a long time Vegas. He worked the Vegas circuit for a long time.
Right. It doesn't mean that you're not
Danny Infante.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to ask about, because the book transitions, and I want to do this with you. The book transitions more into like a history of your pop and then your biography, because one of the things that fascinates me about history, and I think you'll appreciate this if you don't already know it, President Tyler, who was the guy after Jackson or Van Buren, he's in that time frame, right? No, he worked. He was after Harrison. When Harrison dies after a month, he's the president. That guy has grandkids, not grandkids that are still alive today, and he was president in 1830 or something like that. So his dad signed the Declaration of Independence. That's how far back. So this guy's got grandkids that are still alive. Granted, these guys are in their 90s and super old, but that's how young this country is. So your connection, I mean, it's incredible because your dad goes back quite a ways, and then all of these people kind of funnel into your existence, and they are either through playing or through watching or through talking. You're given this entire history that a lot of it isn't written down. A lot of these guys don't survive very long. I mean, Robert Johnson's dead at 27,
That's right.
So that has to be like the foundation of who you are and how you represent. You talk about like it's, your music. You are the blues, and you are like this unique historical point. Can you even pass that on? So talk a little bit about how you built this knowledge from all of your experiences, working with your dad at Tabby's Blues Box and all of these things.
Yeah, it's talking about myself. I'm always a little more, you can tell I've been talking about everything else, trying not to talk about myself personally, because I'm a little bit more not, as practiced at that, and a little bit more uncomfortable. And, I don't want to use the word shy. I don't think that's the right word, but I'm a little bit more, I love talking about Jelly Roll or whoever else. I don't, now, so let me put on my author's hat right now. So I'll talk as an author, because now I'm an author. I wasn't an author, when I started writing the book.
Right.
And I didn't have my writing voice. I had to learn how to write. And this book is, I would argue, and I present it as being the first history of the blues. And it's the first history of the blues, annotated history, written by a black person.
Right. And
more than that, written by a person from the culture.
Yeah.
So it's like a Native American, who is, a lot of stuff have been written about them. All these John Wayne movies have been made, and the Alamo and all this other, we've heard all these stories about the Native Americans and the Wild West and stuff like this, and how the country was, manifest destiny or whatever.
Right.
And then a Native American comes along and tell you, hey, here's the real story.
Yeah.
And look at artifacts and look at objects and say, this is what this meant. You might have a popular meaning for this. The Anglo-Saxons might have their own version of what they call this and stuff, but this is what it meant to us.
Right.
This is our culture. This is how the events took place from our point of view.
Right.
So that's kind of that's why the book, like you say, it starts broad, and then it kind of, the last few chapters, is funneled through my story, because, a lot of people watching might not follow the blues and might not know who Muddy Waters or know anything about other blues musicians or B.B. King, or they probably never heard of B.B. King. Who knows? Yeah. But there are no other blues artists out there writing that have written this story, and there are no other blues artists in America or in the world saying and screaming that the blues did not come from Mississippi. It came from New Orleans. Right. So my family, my father, he opened his club, Tabby's Blues Box, to kind of reconnect, because the blues had been taken over. It was all about Chicago and all about this and that. And he was trying to reconnect, this continuum where the blues began with Louisiana and bring some kind of recognition, and I came along as a teenager when he opened that place. I was a teenager in the late 70s when Tabby's Blues Box was open. And I didn't understand all of these things I'm telling you now. I had some instincts about them, and I had a hunch about things. But until I really started doing deep research with my book and found my voice as a writer, I couldn't articulate these things. It's one thing to know something. It's another thing to be able to articulate it. And I'm still probably butchering the English language while we're talking here,
Same.
Yeah. So, it was a lot to chew off, but I felt that if I didn't tell this story, then who was going to tell it?
Yeah.
Because this culture is being lost. The memory of it is being lost. Blues is no longer, in my opinion, as we know it today, ostensibly, it's not a black musical genre. And of course, nobody but me was saying that the blues came from Louisiana and not from Mississippi.
Yeah.
Nobody is telling people that there were never any slaves in what we call the state of Mississippi Delta.
Yeah.
There were never any black slaves. There's no black history there.
Right.
Yet professors at Yale and Harvard and all these high, Ivy League institutions, they continue to perpetuate this madness.
Right.
And since they won't speak about it, and I guess then I was angry with the black intelligentsia, because they failed us. It's like, the blues people, I come from like people that were illiterate, people that really, weren't well spoken, people that, had a tough time writing their name, let alone a letter or whatever. And that's why they would beat out of their music and beat out of their copyrights and things like this. And so I come from these people, and we don't have a blues intellectual.
Right.
Where's the blues intellectual that can give voice? And who's speaking up for us? We're losing the whole culture. And if you raise the blues boat, all boats rise.
Yeah.
Blues is the foundation of Black American culture. And if you don't understand this, you shouldn't be, those movies you're making, I cringe when I see these movies on Netflix. When I go on Broadway, Broadway is really embarrassing. It's really embarrassing because they take this Anglo-Saxon Protestant fairy tale, like a Grimm Brothers fairy tale, and they keep repeating that like that's like that's Black history, and it's not. And so after my dad's place was closed and razed in 1999, and he took ill, and then Katrina happened, and I lost my home in New Orleans, and a lot of musicians like myself were scattered all over America.
Right.
Then I really knew that, I can't just write a memoir about my time growing up at my dad's club, which is kind of how I started. When I started researching, I realized the blues didn't have a history, and I had to fill that space. I would love to just be here playing the guitar, man, and, drinking a little wine with you, and we just having a good old time.
Yeah.
But, now I have to become a blues intellectual because there's no blues intellectual. So I have to fill that space, but I'm hopeful that what I've written, can inspire other people to do more research,
right,
to inspire other people to bring out these stories and delve into this culture. Because my book could have been an 800-page book, and I could still be writing.
Yeah.
There's more to get out there.
Yeah.
But I'm bringing all this together. The reason why at the end of the book it's not really a memoir is just that I was the protagonist. My dad was the protagonist, and I was a protagonist trying to connect the blues to Jelly Roll, trying to connect the blues to its origins, and that's why it don't focus on all the blues. It's the history of the blues,
right?
But sometimes you just have one protagonist because they're upholding, the ideals or the memory, or fighting, for some kind of legitimacy or survival.
Yeah.
And that fell on me.
Grab that book so everybody can take a look at it.
And I can guarantee you that it's a big risk to tell people that the blues didn't come from Mississippi, because the industry is built on that.
Right.
Tourism is built on that.
Yeah.
To tell Louisiana that jazz is a misnomer of the blues, I was booked to play the Jazz Fest this year. I'm not here to tell Quint Davis or tell the Jazz Fest that they need to change the name of their program.
Right.
But we took down these Confederate statues, and jazz, Dixieland jazz And jazz is just short for Dixieland jazz.
Right.
Nothing more.
Right.
They might try to tell you it came from a baseball game, and they try to follow the etymology is just that Dixieland jazz is named after a racist Italian named Nicola Rock, a trumpet player.
Uh-huh.
And they wanted to make him the king of the blues. And they called the music his fan clubs all over the country started calling all the music that played in that style Dixieland jazz. And then Dixieland, of course, fell out of favor.
Right.
But the word jazz stuck. And like I say in my book, it's kind of like calling my high school, which was Robert E. Lee. Okay, we're not going to call it Robert E. Lee anymore. We're just going to call it Lehigh.
Right.
It's just as offensive. I mean, what are we doing?
Yeah.
So the thing is that jazz is a Confederate stamp on black culture. Mm. And Miles Davis said that. I quote him in the book. He said jazz is a nigger word.
Right.
And he didn't like critics calling his music jazz, and the musicians that played with him, and he believed he was a blues musician.
Yeah.
But even though he couldn't market himself as such, but he make no mistake, he knew he was a blues musician, and he despised the word jazz.
Yeah.
And so jazz is a misnomer. And it's time with those Confederate statues, it's time for us to put jazz, on the shelf.
Yeah.
The word jazz, because it has no meaning in no African etymology and no Creole etymology. And Louis Armstrong didn't call himself a jazz musician.
Right. Right. Yeah. So we could stop calling him one.
I mean, West End blues is a blues.
Yeah, it's the blues. It's in the title.
I mean, what are we doing?
It's in the title.
What are we doing?
Show everybody that book, man. The Blues and Chris's
The Blues,
book.
the authentic narrative of my music and culture. 400 pages. This is not ghostwritten, and I didn't collaborate with somebody.
Right.
I wrote every word, and it was painstaking, really, man. I have a lot of respect for authors and writers.
Yeah.
Because I had no idea.
Yeah.
What it took to write a nonfiction, history like this.
Yeah, and it's a dense read. I mean, I was having to, as I read, because a lot of it was brand new to me. And so as I read it, I had to go and read reference material to understand the person you were talking about. Because you only have so many words you can write about Tony Jackson, for example. Like, well, hold on, who's this? I've never heard of this person. Let me understand it. And then you would make these claims, and you'd be like, well, hold on a second. You can't make that claim. Now let me go back and look. And then I just started looking at your notes and just go, okay, this is all sourced well. And I loved it. I thought it was a fascinating book. It challenged me. If you want to be challenged in the history and try to understand something, even if you disagree with Chris, you can read the book and go, wow, that's a lot for me to consider. And if you come to a different conclusion, okay, but go through the book and do it first. So get the book. It'll be in the show notes. You can click on there and buy Chris's book. But what else? I mean, we've been doing this over an hour, a super easy hour for me. But what do you want to close with? Like, what's important for us to understand about your music and your book?
Well, I didn't write this book thinking that I was going to be embraced, by other blues musicians or by, people that make their living, playing blues and jazz. I wasn't expecting to be embraced, at least initially. Yeah. But I think if people take their time to read the book, make their own, draw their own conclusions. Mm-hmm. And I'm not perfect. I mean, there might be some things that I missed, but I didn't make anything up. The conclusions I came to are the only conclusions you can come to. Some things you can't, you can try to argue.
Right.
If you want to tell me that New Orleans is not the Mississippi Delta,
yeah.
Okay. Go for that, but I'm going to stick with the fact that New Orleans is the Mississippi, was built by the river from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, as Mark Twain said.
Yeah.
The scientific people say that was built by the river over 1 million years.
Yeah.
The fact that there were no black slaves in this part of northern Mississippi that we call the Mississippi Delta. If you want to argue with me, I wasn't there.
Yeah.
But I imagine neither were that person that's arguing with me. Neither were you,
Yeah.
So I can only go by the artifacts. I can only go by the facts, by the records that we have. And there's no record of slaves there. Matter of fact, that was the Chickasaw Nation in northern Mississippi up until the Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson drove them out of.
So Chickasaw invented the blues.
either the Chickasaw or those black bears up there.
Yeah.
But there was no musical culture that we know of
Right.
in Mississippi Delta. The Chickasaw Nation and the Choctaw Nation because Vicksburg is not the Mississippi Delta. Jackson, Mississippi is not the Mississippi Delta. Robert Johnson was not born in the Mississippi Delta. He was born in the southern part of Mississippi, below Jackson. Mm-hmm. And most blues artists weren't born in this area. There were no white men in antebellum northern Mississippi because that was the Chickasaw Nation.
Right.
And they didn't remove those people until the 1840s. But even when you removed them and moved them to Oklahoma and other places, the yeomen and, poor whites from Appalachian stuff, they didn't start making it into northern Mississippi until like the 1840s or so, 1850s. But then the Civil War came.
Right.
And they never were able to make the levees, and you couldn't plant anything there because it flooded seasonally.
Right.
So it was long after the Civil War, long around the 1890s. And I document that in the book. Mound Bayou was one of the first black towns that we could call black people being in the Mississippi Delta. And I'm not going to go into that now, but that was part of the book. But I'm just saying that this is something that I might have missed something. There are no slave quarters in the Mississippi Delta. In Louisiana, there's still slave quarters. You can go visit. Slavery did happen in Louisiana. It was notorious. Yeah. And you can go visit these plantations. It was real. You can't visit any slave quarters in this area that's called the Mississippi Delta. There's no black history there. Yeah. And when black writers and movie makers and people on Broadway and people writing books still perpetuate these white supremacist myths about black people, it irks me. And what I realize is that I can't just be angry at the black intellectuals. I need to try to make myself one.
Right.
But because they're only going to know what's in the library.
Right. Well, you got to publish, just like Jelly Roll had to publish.
Yeah.
Everybody else.
The books that are in the libraries don't tell this story, but now we have a book in the library. Maybe they'll stumble upon it, and maybe they'll, change their tune about about the foundation of Black American culture.
The book is The Blues, The Authentic Narrative of My Music and Culture by Chris Thomas King. Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.